The sun blazed over the dusty highway as a gang of leather-clad bikers roared into a remote gas station. Their laughter echoed, drowning the soft hum of cicadas. A frail, elderly woman with a cane shuffled toward the vending machine, her trembling hand reaching for a soda. One biker sneered, "Lost, Grandma?" Another kicked her cane, sending her sprawling. But as she hit the ground, her eyes turned sharp, and a chilling smile curled her lips. "You boys messed with the wrong woman," she whispered. The highway stretched endlessly under the blistering midday sun, its heat waves creating mirages on the horizon. At a remote gas station surrounded by barren land, the faint hum of cicadas filled the heavy air. Inside, the wiry gas station clerk who had seen his share of trouble leaned against the counter flipping through an old magazine. His lazy afternoon was shattered by the deep, thunderous roar of motorcycles, a sound that carried danger. The Hellhounds, a gang whose reputation for lawlessness was infamous, descended upon the station like a pack of wolves. Their leader, Tank, dismounted first, a massive man with a shaved head, tattoos covering his bulging arms, and a vest adorned with crude patches. Tank was the kind of man you didn't cross. Behind him came Scar, his wiry second-in-command, with a face scarred from countless brawls. A dozen other bikers followed, each exuding arrogance as they parked their bikes haphazardly across the lot. Outside, an elderly woman approached a vending machine, her bent frame supported by a cane. She wore a faded, floral dress, her silver hair tied back into a loose bun. The sight of her frailty in this desolate place seemed almost surreal. Her slow, deliberate movements went unnoticed, at first. Tank nudged Scar, nodding toward her. "Look at that. Lost, Grandma?" he said, his booming voice drawing laughter from his crew. Scar, ever the provocateur, swaggered toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Hey, lady, you know where you are? This ain't no place for bingo and tea." The woman ignored them, her trembling hand retrieving a coin from her pocket. She slipped it into the vending machine, the soft clink drowned out by the biker's jeers. The machine hummed, delivering a soda can into the tray. As she bent to retrieve it, Scar kicked her cane, sending it clattering to the ground. The sudden sound froze the gas station clerk mid-breath. He ducked behind the counter, his heart pounding. The bikers erupted into laughter, but it died quickly when the woman straightened, soda in hand, and turned to face them. Her eyes, sharp and unflinching, met Scar's. The laughter faded into uneasy silence. Tank stepped forward, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "What's this? Granny's got a backbone?" he mocked. "You're in Hellhound territory, lady. That means you owe us a toll." He reached for her soda, confident in his dominance. In a flash, her free hand moved, twisting his wrist in a motion that sent him stumbling back with a shout of pain. The soda can remained firmly in her grip. The gang stared, stunned into silence as their leader shook out his hand, his face reddening with humiliation. Scar, enraged, lunged with a knife, but the woman, far quicker than her age suggested, sidestepped, delivering a sharp blow to the back of his knee with her cane. He collapsed with a grunt, clutching his leg. The rest of the gang hesitated, their bravado faltering as the woman turned her icy gaze toward them. "You boys think you own the road?" she said, her voice calm but cutting. "Think again." Tank's face twisted into a snarl. "She's just some crazy old hag. Get her," he barked. The bikers advanced, weapons drawn, but the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she shifted her stance, her movements fluid and deliberate as if anticipating their every move. What followed was chaos. The bikers attacked, but their wild, uncoordinated strikes were no match for her precision. Her cane became an extension of herself, striking wrists, ribs, and knees with deadly accuracy. A biker swung a crowbar, only to miss as she ducked and retaliated with a strike that left him gasping for air. Another lunged with a chain, only to find himself flipped onto the gravel. The soda can in her hand became a projectile, hitting one man square in the forehead and sending him sprawling. Inside, the clerk watched in disbelief. His fingers hovered over the silent alarm, but he hesitated, unsure if anyone would believe what he was seeing. The frail old woman he had dismissed moments ago was dismantling the hellhounds as if she had trained for this her entire life. Minutes later, the dust settled. The gas station lot was littered with groaning bikers. Tank, bruised and furious, knelt on the ground, clutching his side. Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and rage. The woman tilted her head slightly, a faint smile on her lips. "Just someone passing through," she said. She turned and walked toward her car, the rhythmic tap of her cane echoing in the stillness. The bikers, too stunned to move, watched her climb into her vehicle and drive off, the hum of her engine fading into the distance. The clerk finally stepped outside, his legs unsteady. His gaze shifted from the battered gang to the retreating silhouette of the woman's car. "What? What just happened?" he whispered to no one in particular. The cicadas resumed their hum as the hellhounds sat in the dust, nursing their wounds and their bruised pride. The quiet returned to the station, but it was now heavy with a story that would grow into legend. The sun dipped lower in the sky as the beaten hellhounds regrouped at the gas station. Tank, clutching his ribs, barked at his men. "She's not getting away with this." His voice carried fury, but his gang's confidence was shaken. Scar, still nursing his knee, spat angrily. "You're just gonna let her walk? That hag humiliated us." Tank glared, his fists clenched. "Nobody humiliates the hellhounds. We'll track her down and make her pay." Trigger, one of the younger bikers, hesitated before speaking. "Boss, what if she's not just some old lady? She moved like—" His voice trailed off, drawing sneers from the others. Scar scoffed. "A ninja? You're losing it." But even Scar couldn't ignore the unease creeping in. She hadn't been lucky. She had fought like someone who'd been in combat before. Tank slammed his fist on the hood of a bike. "I don't care if she's a ninja or the devil himself. Nobody crosses us. Find out where she's headed," he ordered one of the bikers with a phone. After a few moments, the biker looked up. "South, Clearwater, about 20 miles. Tank's lips curled into a grin. "Perfect. Saddle up, boys. We're not done." Clearwater was a quiet town with modest homes and a diner known for its pie. The woman sat in a corner booth, sipping coffee with her cane resting beside her. The waitress placed a plate of pie before her. "Anything else, ma'am?" The woman smiled faintly. "No, thank you. This is plenty." Her voice was calm, soothing. To anyone watching, she was a harmless traveler. But her sharp eyes occasionally flicked toward the window. She wasn't naive. The hellhounds wouldn't let this go. She was right. The roar of motorcycles shattered the town's peace. Residents peeked from behind curtains as the hellhounds swarmed in, their engines growling like thunder. Tank led the pack, skidding his bike to a halt outside the diner. He motioned for his men to surround the building. Inside, the waitress froze, her tray trembling. "What's going on?" she whispered. The woman set her coffee cup down gently. "You'd best stay in the back," she said calmly. The waitress hesitated but obeyed, disappearing into the kitchen. The door jingled as Tank entered, his broad shoulders filling the frame. His eyes locked onto the woman who looked up at him as if she had been expecting him. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Tank growled. "But this ends now." The woman leaned back slightly. "You came all this way for little old me? Flattering." Tank's lips twisted. "You humiliated me and my crew. Nobody does that and walks away." The woman tilted her head. "I warned you at the station. You should have let it go." Scar, knife in hand, snarled, "Let's see how tough you are without that cane." He lunged, but the woman moved faster. With a swift motion, she flipped the table, sending the pie and coffee flying. The heavy wood slammed into Scar, knocking him into another biker. "Get her!" Tank roared. Chaos erupted. Chairs toppled, glass shattered, and shouts filled the air. The woman moved like a storm, using her cane to block and counter every strike. A knife slashed toward her, but she twisted the biker's wrist, forcing him to drop it with a yelp. Another tried to grab her from behind, but she ducked and threw him into a booth. A third swung a chair at her, only for her to kick it out of his hands. Despite the odds, her movements were precise, deliberate, and devastating. Tank stood back, watching with clenched fists. This wasn't just an elderly woman. She was a fighter, and a damn good one. The sound of sirens in the distance brought the chaos to an abrupt halt. The bikers froze as the wail grew louder. Tank cursed. "This isn't over," he snarled, signaling for his men to retreat. The hellhounds fled, their engines roaring as they sped out of town. The diner was left in ruins, chairs overturned, glass littering the floor. The woman adjusted her cane, her breathing steady. The waitress peeked out cautiously. "It's safe now," the woman said simply. The waitress stepped forward, wide-eyed. Who are you?" she asked. The woman didn't answer. She left money on the counter, enough to cover the meal and damages, and walked out. As her car disappeared into the distance, the townspeople emerged, their whispers filling the air. Trouble had come to Clearwater, and it wasn't finished yet. The hellhounds regrouped at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Clearwater. Their bikes stood parked haphazardly outside, engines cooling under the dim evening light. Inside, the gang was in disarray. Tank paced furiously, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. Scar, still nursing his injured knee, sat on a crate with a scowl. Trigger, one of the youngest members, nervously shifted in place. "She's not human," Trigger blurted out, his voice trembling. "Did you see how she moved? Like a ghost." "Shut up," Tank roared, silencing the room. Trigger flinched, shrinking into the background. The gang's confidence had been shattered, and their leader's fury only deepened their unease. They hadn't just lost. They'd been humiliated. And worse, they couldn't figure out how. Tank stopped pacing and turned to Scar. "You've been around. Ever seen anything like her?" Scar hesitated, his fingers tracing the scar running down his jaw. "Not exactly," he said slowly. "But I've heard stories about someone they called the Widow." The name lingered in the air, silencing the group. Even Trigger froze. Tank narrowed his eyes. "Who?" Scar leaned forward. "They said she was government, black ops, a ghost, the kind of operative who went in, handled problems, and disappeared. They said she was unstoppable. But one day, she vanished. Rumor had it, if you ever saw a spiderweb tattoo on someone's wrist, you'd know you were dealing with her." Tank frowned. "A spiderweb tattoo?" Scar nodded. "Small, black, like a signature." Trigger swallowed hard. "You think that old lady is the widow?" The gang exchanged uneasy glances. Tank slammed his fist onto a table, scattering tools. "I don't care who she was. She humiliated us, twice, and we're not letting it slide." At a quiet motel in the next town, the woman sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the road outside. The room was sparse but clean, with a single lamp casting a warm glow over the worn furniture. Her fingers brushed the faint spiderweb tattoo on her wrist, a reminder of the life she thought she'd left behind. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. Rising cautiously, she peered through the peephole. The young motel clerk stood outside, shifting nervously from foot to foot. She opened the door slightly. "Yes?" "Ma'am, sorry to bother you, but there's a group of bikers asking about a woman who looks like you. They're across the street at the gas station." The woman nodded. "Thank you for letting me know. I'll handle it." The clerk hesitated but didn't question her. As he walked away, she retrieved a small bag from under the bed. Inside were relics of her old life: a compact pistol, a length of rope, and a switchblade. She picked up the pistol, its weight familiar in her hand, and slipped it into her pocket. At the gas station, Tank stood with his men, his patience wearing thin. He grabbed the young attendant by the collar, his voice a low growl. "Where is she?" The kid stammered, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know. I swear. Scar stepped forward, his knife glinting under the fluorescent lights. You'd better think hard, kid. We don't like liars. Before the attendant could respond, a sound cut through the night, the sharp clink of a cane against pavement. The hellhounds turned as one, their eyes narrowing. Under the harsh glow of the gas station lights, the woman stepped into view, her figure silhouetted against the shadows. "You boys looking for me?" she asked, her tone calm. Tank released the attendant and took a step forward. "You've got a death wish." The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "No, but it seems you do." The gang moved as one, charging toward her, but the woman was ready. She struck first, her cane swinging in a sharp arc that connected with the nearest biker's knee, sending him collapsing to the ground. Another lunged at her, but she disarmed him with a twist of her wrist, the knife clattering to the ground. Chaos erupted. Scar rushed forward, slashing with his knife, but the woman sidestepped, driving her cane into his injured leg. He crumpled to the ground with a pained howl. Tank stood back, watching with clenched fists. This wasn't just an old lady. This was someone trained, someone lethal. One biker managed to grab her from behind, pinning her arms. Tank saw his chance, advancing with a crowbar. "End of the line, Grandma," he sneered. But the woman shifted her weight, driving her heel into the biker's shin. He released her with a cry, and she turned just in time to dodge Tank's swing. The fight between them was brutal, each blow calculated. Tank managed to land a glancing hit, sending her stumbling. He raised the crowbar for a finishing strike, but the sound of sirens stopped him cold. Red and blue lights flashed as police cars screeched into the lot. "Police! Drop your weapons!" officers shouted. The hellhounds scattered, their bikes roaring into the night. Tank hesitated, locking eyes with the woman. "This isn't over," he snarled before disappearing into the darkness. An officer approached her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She nodded. "I'm fine." But as she walked away, her mind raced. Tank's parting words weren't a threat. They were a promise, and she knew the worst was yet to come. Tank's frustration had reached its boiling point. The hellhounds were scattered and wounded, their reputation tarnished by one woman who refused to back down. Inside their dimly lit hideout, Tank slammed his fist on the table, sending a whiskey bottle crashing to the floor. "This ends now," Tank growled, his voice low and dangerous. "She thinks she can keep running, but she won't outsmart us again." Scar, seated nearby, glanced up from his knife. "You're talking like she's the prey. You sure we're not the ones being hunted?" Tank's eyes burned with rage. "She's just one woman." "She's not just anything," Scar muttered. "You saw what she did to us. She's a problem." Trigger, nervously fumbling with his pistol, finally spoke. "What's the plan, boss? She's already taken us down twice. She doesn't seem like someone who's going to stop." Tank smirked, leaning forward. "We set a trap. She's been picking us off because we've been stupid. This time, we outthink her. Scar, find someone in town who can track her. Trigger, set the bait." The woman stopped at a small, run-down diner on the edge of town. She sat in a corner booth, sipping her coffee while her eyes remained on the road outside. Her instincts told her something had shifted. The hellhounds weren't just chasing her, they were organizing. The waitress refilled her coffee, smiling nervously. "Ma'am, are you all right? You've been sitting here a while." The woman nodded. "I'm fine, just waiting for something." The low rumble of motorcycles broke the quiet. A small group of bikers approached, stopping at a distance. This time, they didn't rush her. They stayed back, and one of them dismounted. Trigger, his face pale but determined, raised his hands to show he wasn't armed. "You've got guts coming back," she called out. Trigger hesitated before speaking. "The boss wants to talk. He's ready to call a truce." She raised an eyebrow. "A truce? After everything?" Trigger nodded quickly. "He just wants to talk, settle this like civilized people." She studied him carefully. The fear in his eyes was real. but so was the sense that he was hiding something. "Where?" she asked. "There's a warehouse on the edge of town," Trigger said, gesturing toward the north. "No tricks?" She nodded. "Tell him I'll come." The warehouse loomed in the distance, its broken windows reflecting faint light. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the smell of rust and mildew pervasive. Her cane tapped against the concrete floor as she entered. This wasn't a truce, it was a trap. "Glad you could make it," Tank's voice boomed, his tone mocking. He emerged from the shadows, flanked by Scar and several bikers. The exits were blocked, just as she expected. "This is hardly a truce," she said, her voice calm. Tank grinned, a predatory glint in his eyes. "It's not, but I figured you'd show up anyway. You've got guts." The first attack came from her left, a biker lunging with a chain. She sidestepped, her cane striking his wrist. Another swung a bat. She deflected it with her cane, delivering a sharp blow to his ribs. He collapsed with a groan. Scar rushed forward, his knife glinting under the faint light. He slashed toward her, but she twisted his wrist, forcing him to drop it. She delivered a swift kick to his injured leg, sending him sprawling. Tank watched from the sidelines, his frustration mounting. "What are you waiting for?" he barked at his men. "Finish her." The remaining bikers surged forward, their movements clumsy but aggressive. The woman fought with precision, her strikes deliberate and efficient, but the odds were against her. One grabbed her from behind, pinning her arms, another swung a crowbar, grazing her side. She gritted her teeth, her movements slowing under the gang's weight. Tank stepped forward, gripping a crowbar tightly in his hands. "Not so tough now, are you?" he sneered, his grin widening. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she shifted her weight, using her captor's hold against him. She drove her heel into his shin, forcing him to release her. She turned to face Tank just as he swung the crowbar. She deflected the blow with her cane, though the impact sent her stumbling. The fight between them was brutal, each strike calculated. Tank landed a hit that sent her reeling, but she quickly regained her footing, her gaze unwavering. Suddenly, the sound of sirens shattered the moment. Red and blue lights flashed outside as police cars screeched to a halt. Officers poured into the warehouse, their weapons drawn. "Drop your weapons," one of them barked. The hellhounds froze, their confidence evaporating. Tank glared at the woman, his knuckles white around the crowbar. "This isn't over," he snarled before retreating into the shadows with his men, his footsteps echoing in the distance. An officer approached her, his flashlight casting a beam across her face. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice steady but concerned. She nodded. "I'm fine." As she walked out of the warehouse, her cane tapping against the floor, her thoughts raced. Tank's words echoed in her mind. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Tank's escape from the warehouse had only fueled his anger. Back at their hideout, he gathered his remaining men, their numbers now reduced after several arrests during the raid. The hellhounds were fractured, but Tank wasn't done. Not yet. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was war. "She's got the cops watching her back now," Scar said, rubbing his injured leg. "This isn't just some street fight anymore. She's playing on another level." Tank paced, his jaw clenched. "I don't care if she's got the whole damn police force behind her. She's not walking away from this." His eyes glinted with dangerous resolve. "We're going to hit her where it hurts." Trigger, seated on a crate, hesitated. "How do we even find her again? She's always a step ahead." Tank stopped, a sinister grin spreading across his face. "We won't have to find her. We'll make her come to us." At her motel, the woman sat by the window, her thoughts racing. Tank's rage had been expected, but his growing tactics were something else. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was strategizing. She had faced men like him before, desperate, dangerous, and unpredictable. Her gaze drifted to the small black bag on the bed. Its contents were laid out neatly. A pistol, a knife, and a length of sturdy rope. The tools felt like relics from a life she thought she had left behind, but they were now necessary. The phone on the nightstand buzzed. A message flashed across the screen. "If you want to end this, come to the old sawmill. No cops, just you and me." She exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the phone. Tank was baiting her, but she couldn't ignore it. Letting him roam free would lead to more chaos. The sawmill was desolate, long abandoned. Rusted machinery lay amidst overgrown weeds, and the faint smell of sawdust lingered. The woman stepped out of her car, her cane in hand, the silence almost deafening. She moved cautiously, her senses sharp. The setting sun cast long shadows across the sawmill's crumbling walls. She knew Tank was here. She could feel it. A faint noise caught her attention. Footsteps. She turned as Trigger emerged from the shadows, hands raised in surrender. "You again," she said, her voice steady. "What do you want?" Trigger hesitated. "Tank's inside. He's waiting for you. Said no one else would interfere." Her eyes narrowed. "And you? Why are you out here?" He faltered. "I don't want any part of this. I'm done." She studied him before nodding. "Then leave." Trigger didn't wait for her to change her mind. He turned and disappeared into the woods, his footsteps fading. She adjusted her grip on her cane and stepped inside. The sawmill's interior was dark, its windows broken and its machinery coated in rust. Her footsteps echoed as she moved deeper into the building. "Glad you made it," Tank's voice boomed. He stepped out from behind a massive saw blade, a crowbar in hand. "Tank," she said evenly, "this doesn't have to go further." "Oh, it's going further," he snarled. "You've humiliated me, torn apart my crew, and ruined everything I've built. You think I'm just going to let that slide?" She tightened her grip on her cane. "This won't end the way you think." "We'll see," Tank growled, charging at her with the crowbar raised. The fight began with a clash of steel and wood, her cane deflecting his strikes with precision. But Tank was strong, each swing of the crowbar sending vibrations through her arms. She sidestepped one of his strikes, using her cane to sweep his legs out from under him. He hit the ground with a grunt but rolled away quickly, coming back to his feet. "You're tougher than you look," he admitted, wiping blood from his lip. "But I've got nothing left to lose." He charged again, his movements wild. She dodged, using the environment to her advantage. A rusted pipe deflected another blow, and a pile of sawdust provided a momentary distraction. But Tank was relentless. He swung the crowbar with reckless abandon, forcing her back against a wall. The impact knocked her cane from her hand, leaving her vulnerable. Tank grinned, raising the crowbar for a final strike. In a swift motion, she drew the pistol from her belt and leveled it at him. "Don't," she said, her voice cold. Tank froze, his grin faltering. "You won't shoot," he said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Try me," she replied. The standoff was broken by the sound of sirens. Tank's eyes darted toward the sound. In that moment, she struck. She swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the floor. The crowbar clattered away as she pressed the pistol to his chest. "This is over," she said firmly. The police arrived moments later, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Officers swarmed the sawmill, arresting Tank and securing the area. One approached her, his expression a mix of awe and concern. "Ma'am, are you all right?" She nodded, lowering the pistol. "I'm fine. He won't be a problem anymore." As she walked out of the sawmill, the night air felt cool against her skin. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. Men like Tank were never the end. They were just the beginning. The quiet of the night settled over the small motel where the woman stayed, but her mind refused to rest. Tank's arrest should have brought her relief, yet unease lingered. Men like Tank didn't operate alone. There was always someone bigger, someone in the shadows. She stared at the faint spiderweb tattoo on her wrist, a relic from a life she thought was behind her. For years, she had lived under the radar, avoiding them. Now, it seemed, her past had finally caught up. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. The sound was jarring in the stillness. She hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was calm, but laced with authority. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest." "Who is this?" she asked, though she already knew. "Doesn't matter. Tank was a small fish, but his arrest has rattled some cages. The people he worked for? They're not happy." "Let them ask," she replied coldly. "I'm not hiding." The voice paused for a moment. "You might not be, but they're coming for you. And they won't stop." The line went dead. She stared at the phone, her grip tightening. The message was clear. This wasn't over. Miles away, in a dimly lit room, a figure sat in silence watching the news. The headline on the screen read, "Local gang leader arrested after violent showdown at sawmill." Tank's face appeared briefly, his expression defiant even as officers dragged him away. The figure leaned back, their face obscured by shadow. "She's resurfaced," the figure said, their voice low and gravelly. Another person, sharp-featured and younger, stood nearby, nodding. "What do you want to do?" The figure lit a cigar, the orange glow briefly illuminating their face. "Bring her in. Alive. It's time she learned you can't walk away forever." "And if she resists?" the younger man asked. The figure smirked. "Then remind her why she left in the first place." The next morning, the woman awoke to the sound of tires crunching gravel outside her motel room. She pulled the curtain back slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing at the sight of two black SUVs parked nearby. Men in dark suits stepped out, their movements deliberate. They weren't police. She grabbed her black bag, slipping the pistol into her waistband and the knife into her boot. A knock came at the door. She didn't answer. "Ms. Walker," a man's voice called out, calm but firm. "We just want to talk." She stayed silent, her grip tightening on her cane. The knock came again, harder this time, but she was already moving. The window at the back of the room slid open silently, and she slipped out, her movements swift despite the cane. As she made her way through the alley behind the motel, she heard footsteps following her. She ducked into a side street, blending into the morning crowd. One of the men spotted her, and the chase began. Through narrow alleys and bustling markets, her years of training kicked in. She vaulted obstacles with her cane, creating distance, but the men were relentless, their coordination impressive. They weren't amateurs. By the time she reached the outskirts of the city, her breathing was steady, but her mind raced. She slipped into an abandoned factory, the silence inside deafening. She needed a plan. Her hand brushed the pistol at her side. She had spent years avoiding this kind of confrontation, but it seemed her past had finally found her. Moments later, the men entered the factory, their footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. They fanned out, their movements cautious but confident. They underestimated her. She used the shadows to her advantage, taking out the first man silently. His radio crackled as she dragged him into the darkness. "Unit 3, report," a voice demanded. When no answer came, the others grew tense. The second man didn't see her coming. She disarmed him with a swift strike of her cane, the weapon clattering to the floor. A sharp blow to his temple rendered him unconscious. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "Ms. Walker," he called out, "you're making this harder than it needs to be." She stepped into the light, her expression calm but unyielding. "You should have stayed away." The man smirked. "We both know that was never an option." He moved quickly, drawing a knife, but she was faster. Their fight was brutal, each strike calculated. She used her cane to deflect his attacks, her movements fluid and efficient. When he lunged, she sidestepped, delivering a sharp blow to his ribs. "You've lost," she said, her voice steady. He glared at her, clutching his side. "This isn't over." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The remaining men scattered, their mission failed. She stood alone in the factory, her breathing steady. The fight was over. For now. Back at her motel, she packed her belongings quickly. She knew this was only the beginning. Tank might have been the spark, but the fire had spread. As she slid the black bag over her shoulder, she glanced at the spiderweb tattoo on her wrist. It was a reminder of who she had been, and who she might have to become again. The road stretched ahead, endless and uncertain. But one thing was clear. She wasn't running. Not anymore.